cold in here.
Yeah, but that's all right. Oh, so we do, actually, yeah. This is embarrassing.
Apparently your mic is on. So I've been asked to encourage those of you who can to move inward and fill in the middle seats, because otherwise you'll have people climbing over you who come in late, which is a degree of kindness you may not wish to extend to the latecomers. But please do.
Talk to each other or to the audience for shooting? I mean, what is the best? To the audience.
Can I start? Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm Matt Rojansky, Director of the Kennan Institute, for those who don't know me. You'll notice we don't have name placards because we're doing something a little bit different than the usual scholarly panel about events in Russia and the region. Today we're going to launch what will be a series of events in the course of the next year or so on the 25th anniversary of the end of the Soviet Union and the beginning of a new era for the region, including an independent Russia and, of course, the other states of the former Soviet Union. This event today, and I hope at least the series, is really going to stand for the unique take that the Kennan Institute seeks to have on the issues that many of us, all of us in this room, are interested in. That is something that is based, of course, in deep knowledge and hands-on experience in the region and with the region, but that seeks to remain connected to the questions that drive American foreign policy. That's why, after all, we're in this town. That's why George Kennan had the vision to put us in this town. And, of course, to promote ultimately the goal of enhanced mutual understanding between this country and the region we seek to understand, and to do so by connecting with the people who are there. And I think, in a way, this event actually does all three of those things, and it does them, I hope, with a little bit of style and flourish. But without a doubt, we have gathered the right people here today to talk about this topic. And I, as your humble moderator, maybe am the exception. But I will do my best to rise to the occasion. I won't note how old I was in August of 1991, because I'm sure that one of my fellow panelists here will do that at some point. I used to get young man with no small amount of irony from this gentleman when he would direct me in the right direction. Let me just, as a matter of housekeeping, note that the next event that we can welcome you to here in our fall kickoff at the Kennan Institute is very different, very lighthearted. It's a celebration of 25 years of Kyrgyz independence through jazz. We'll have an evening of jazz with the Salt Peanuts, a Kyrgyz jazz combo here from 5 to 7 p.m. on Thursday. So we welcome you for that. And of course, we'll have the ambassador of Kyrgyzstan and our own Blair Rubel, who was director of the Kennan Institute during the events in question, and is also a leading expert on jazz in the city of Washington, D.C. So I hope you can join us for that. Without further ado, some very brief introductions, because I think all three of these gentlemen are the sort who really need no introduction. Andrei Kozyrev joined the Soviet Foreign Ministry in 1974. He was head of the Department of International Organizations, and then published an article in 1988 about what a new Soviet foreign policy in keeping with glasnost and perestroika might look like. And from that moment forward, really became the leading liberal voice in Soviet and then Russian foreign policy circles. Served as foreign minister of the RSFSR from October of 1990, so before the coup, and retained that position then when Russia became independent, and served as foreign minister of Russia until 1996. He was a participant in the historic decision in December of 1991 between the leaders of Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine to peacefully dissolve the Soviet Union. And after his service as foreign minister of Russia, he continued in the Russian Duma for 4 years, representing the northern city of Murmansk. Jim Collins, to whom I've already made reference, started his career while visiting the Soviet Union actually in the 1960s as a student, but also then as second secretary in the embassy with responsibility for Middle East affairs from 73 to 75, a not inauspicious time to have that responsibility. He was DCM in the embassy in Moscow under Ambassadors Matlock, Strauss, and Pickering from 1990 to 93, but his timing was so fortuitous, and I hope he'll say a word about this. Maybe fortuitous isn't the right word, but that he was Chargé d'Affaires, so he was the senior American diplomat in the Soviet Union, and certainly in Moscow at the time of the coup and a few other important events around that same time. He returned to Washington then in 1993, where he became ambassador at large and special advisor to the secretary and the president on the newly independent states. He became then ambassador to Russia on the appointment of President Clinton in August 1996 and served until 2001, and another important transitional moment. So we were speculating earlier, or rather Andrei was suggesting that there might be more than coincidence in some of the timing, that in fact, if there's an American puppet master, maybe you're looking at him. Sergey Parkhomenko is a graduate of the Department of Journalism of Moscow State University, who worked as a political reporter and a columnist for Russian daily newspapers in the early 1990s. He worked during the August events of 1991 for Nezavisimaya Gazeta, which had just then been established by the Moscow City Council, and he was, together with a collective of journalists writing in the Obshaya Gazeta, among the first to actually level the accusation at the emergency committee and really tell the truth about what was going on. He founded the Moscow Journalist Charter in 1994 and Russia's first news magazine called Itogi in 1996. And since 2003, on Echo Moskvy, he has hosted the show Sut Sabытий, the crux of the matter, and is in fact still doing the same from here. So, without further ado, we're going to have a conversation now for about an hour, and then we're going to open the floor to questions from the audience. Who, when I look out at you, I realize almost any one of you has a whole story to tell about what you experienced at that time. So we'll definitely invite comments, questions, recollections from the audience. But let's start with this. Andrei, what happened? How did you find out what was going on? What did you think was going on? What was going on that day?
I just want to allow myself one brief remark on where you ended. Sergey is one of the best, if not the best, journalist in Russia today, not even in last time, but today, and he speaks in his program on Echo Moskvy with amazing and breathtaking clarity and courage, because it takes courage to be there and to speak as straightforward as he does. With that, you probably know the name of Pyotr Tchaikovsky, and you probably know that he was a great Russian composer in the 19th century. But you don't know that it was Tchaikovsky who told me what happened that day at 6 o'clock in the morning. because I am an early bird, and I usually, even today, I wake up at 6 o'clock and I exercise and try also to see some news on TV. When I realized in first 5 minutes, oh, I'm sorry, maybe it could be regulated one way or the other. Yeah. So when I realized that I am known to be soft-spoken, so I would appreciate if I keep in my usual hopeless way, and we just have a little bit of technical. Whatever. When I realized that it was Swan Lake on all the it was probably all three channels in the Soviet Union, it was absolutely clear to me what happened, because my calculus was very, very simple. Gorbachev was too young to pass away, because Tchaikovsky and this Swan Lake, which I adore, which I welcome, of course, every time on TV or on stage. But before, it happened only when one after the other ailing Soviet leaders were passing away. So since Gorbachev was much younger and much healthier, that meant something which we had been waiting for already for a year, that is crackdown. Then I rushed to my car and I went to Moscow. And on the way, I thought that I probably would not go to my small ministry. I was not on Smolenskaya Ploshchad, which is famous for Soviet. Because after I joined the Yeltsin government, I was moved to that humble setting, that small building. So I thought that I would be lonely probably in that building, and I went to the so-called White House. That is the center at that time. It was both parliament and government and presidential office there. There, I was always very lonely, as a matter of fact. I entered the building at 8 something, 8 and a
Did you know it, Andrei, did you know at that point where Yeltsin was?
No.
Did you think he might have been arrested or something?
I did not think that he was arrested because I was not arrested, and I mean, it sounds like presumptive, but that's true. I mean, if they were to arrest to everybody, because I was in the same dacha, in the same compound outside of Moscow where he was, and his house, which he occupied, was just maybe 4 or 5 buildings, small buildings from me. So it was in a 100 meters, kind of, maybe something like that. So why would they cherry picking? I mean, they would certainly take, and there was a handful of us who were known to the press and publicly known names of that kind in the government at that time. So, and that's number one. Number two, on my way from the compound to Moscow, actually to the center of Moscow, I passed 2 or 3 block posts. And usually those block posts were just traffic police. But this time, there were already armored carriers standing on those block posts with military men with machine guns, which was absolutely unusual, I mean, unheard of. And, of course, along with those machine gun uniformed people, army people, along with them were gray clothes, 3 or 5 guys, easily recognized as KGB or something like that. So when we came to the block post, actually, my driver turned to me and said, "Should we make a U-turn?" And I said, "That's probably a good idea." That was my first reaction, of course. But my second thought was that it's senseless. I mean, if they want to catch us, I mean, no question. So I said, no, please, just go straight and we'll see what happens. And they all were looking at us, you know, at my car, because the car, of course, they knew the number, and I was recognizable, and the car was transparent enough. Old Volga, you know, with a low speed, but a lot of noise, so it was kind of very pompous, my entrance into Moscow every day, with all that noise, crack, and all that. So, and what happened? That nothing happened, despite they were looking at me, you know, like, "Are you mad or what?" But they didn't move. So next post, I thought, okay, now they probably are astonished or whatever, surprised. But the next, they will, of course, telephone or whatever, and that's where we talk to them. No, nothing happened again. So I came to this so-called White House. It was absolutely empty, outside and inside. So I went in, and I started looking for somebody. And then a guard downstairs, my friend, a young guy, he said that Shachrai, Sergey Shachrai, came also earlier, but unusually nobody is coming. He was very, very surprised. And I said, "That's okay." So I went to Shachrai's office, and there we were for maybe half an hour, trying to call Yeltsin, actually. And after that, we succeeded to call Yeltsin, and but he did not answer himself. It was Burbulis, his closest aide at that time, the most close. And actually, we told them that both Sergey and myself, that we made it through the blog posts. That was very important news, very important information for them, because they were exactly thinking whether to go to Moscow or what to do. And when they learned that we did pass all that without any kind of harassment or interruption, so that was a piece of information. And also Shachrai exposed to them, to Burbulis, he told him what he thought from legal point of view. And that was not so easy, because at that moment already the announcement was on TV, and they were speaking, those guys, the so-called plotters. But when we looked at the picture, or probably their names were read, but when we heard who is doing that, that sounded kind of amazing, because it was vice president, it was the whole cabinet, actually, the KGB, the all ministers, and prime minister. So it was vice president, prime minister, and all other key ministers. So what kind of coup is that? I mean, and Gorbachev was officially, by that time, he was vacationing, by the way, in Crimea. So that's probably why Crimea. I mean, what kind of coup? And they called themselves New Soviet Leadership.
So when
we were puzzled, because
Andrei, when you and the Yeltsin aides realized who was behind this thing, on the one hand, and on the other hand, you realized Yeltsin was free, you were free. People, you know, clearly this wasn't a terribly well-organized coup. Was it clear to you at that point that you were going to prevail, or did you think the opposite?
No, we you know, living in the Soviet Union, as in today's Russia, you get used to kind of not so perfect an organization of everything, including a coup or something. But you know, our first reaction was cursing ourselves because we were not prepared. Despite, as I mentioned, for a year already, we had been waiting for something because it was in the air, something like this. There was no plan in preparation. Everything, we were taken by surprise. So we were not quite surprised. Otherwise, we thought that sooner or later they will come after us. Then Yeltsin came and Chargé explained his legal point of view, and I asked one question. What about a press conference inviting foreign ambassadors, foreign embassies, and journalists, because they probably do not understand it was even difficult for us, and explain all that and make a statement if Yeltsin comes, denouncing it like whatever, crackdown or whatever, and coup, and then and I had green light on that, and from that moment we started, me and some of my staff in the small foreign ministry, we started to call embassies and ask them to come for the press conference. And Yeltsin and Burbules, they were preparing the statement. They put together a statement with contribution from Chargé and my humble self, a few phrases, and then they took the car and made it again. Nobody stopped them. So they just came in an hour time or so. That's what I saw. And one more kind of scenic impression, which I remember very, very vividly, that while we were preparing for the press conference and kind of thinking what is really happening, we saw from the windows, because it's a very, very well panoramic view from the windows. We were in Yeltsin's office at that moment. So all of us, not many, just maybe 10, 15 people altogether. And we were looking in the windows, and we saw the tanks, battle tanks, kind of dusty, so real thing. I mean, coming from the bridge to the building. And that, at least I thought, and I know that most of us thought that if they bring tanks, which was unheard of, to Moscow, to the center, so we should expect the KGB or whatever commanders right away. And we were absolutely helpless and absolutely defenseless. So, and again, nothing happened. But on the other, so that was from the bridge side. But from the other side, we saw Mercedes and, you know, these luxury limousines with flags coming from embassies, Western embassies, of course, American and Western European, NATO, so to say. So that was kind of amazing view.
That is really a perfect transition. There are a couple of moments I want to come back to with you, maybe one of those tanks in particular, which became famous. But Jim, same time in the morning, 7 o'clock, right? August 19th. How did you find out what was going on, and what did you think was going on?
Well, I didn't get up as early as Andrei, so I got up about and was down about to have breakfast at 7 when Ed Salazar.
You're inside the embassy.
I'm inside Townhouse 1 in the embassy compound, for those who know it, which was about 200 yards from the White House, where Andrei and everyone ends up. I went down, the phone rang, it was Ed Salazar from our political section who said, "Have you listened to the radio?" Which I had not. He said, "Well, you better turn it on." And then he explained that Gorbachev was out, and there was a group saying that they were now in charge, and that music was playing, and newspapers were shut down, and so forth. So my reaction was, why now? You know, in a sense of why me, right? The ambassador had left, I was Chargé, another ambassador was due to come, and there we were. So I got everyone in the embassy, you know, the main section people, and we were not that large at that time. I think the total embassy complement was 254 people. And we sat down to try to compare notes as to what people knew and what we knew about what was going on. My initial reaction when I saw it was they're trying to do 1964 all over again, which was the date that they removed Khrushchev and changed the government. We had known that there were plenty of problems and tensions within the Soviet Union. And we had had rumors of plans for some kind of move against Gorbachev. But frankly, nobody was ready when it happened, and no one had seen it coming when it did. And so essentially, we had two or three things we had to decide. One was, what did we do as the embassy? Because remember, we're 7 hours different. So everybody's more or less asleep in Washington and here. And I think what we did collectively, and I think it was maybe the one decision I ever made in the Foreign Service, was we decided that essentially the embassy would have nothing to do with the new proclaimed authority other than action that would be required to protect American citizens and American property. And there were efforts to get us to be in touch with the new government, but we just didn't answer the phone, basically. Secondly, we basically decided that this was something that was illegal or unconstitutional from anything we could figure out. And nobody knew what the real condition for Gorbachev was. They said he was ill. Well, you know, illness isn't necessarily a reason to change the government. And we were suspicious of what was really the situation. And so we took that posture, and that was the one we adopted. The second thing that was remarkable was it was kind of like you gave a coup and nobody came. You know, as Andrei said, you know, there was nothing in the center of Moscow. I mean, it was quiet. People were normally going about their business. It was August, after all, so everybody's at the dacha, or the city is really kind of on vacation time. And so for a couple of hours, nothing happens. And we had to wonder a bit. We were trying to find out. We didn't, I think, know about the checkpoints, for instance.
Of course.
Because there wasn't anything literally going on in the city. So we didn't know quite what to make of that. And then at a certain point, and Naomi wrote very graphically about this in her book, you know, we hear the rumbling of the tanks coming across the bridge and down the street and pointing themselves at our windows, which wasn't too comforting. So we knew that this was something for real. And the only question was, what? Now, meanwhile, you had the beginnings of people gathering and you know, sort of rumors around that we were picking up that, first of all, Boris Yeltsin was coming to the White House, and he set himself up there, that he was saying this is not a legitimate action and that they were not going to accept it. And therefore, we knew there was some kind of a confrontation. And really, from that point, the morning progressed, sort of as Andrei has described it. I got a call, and at about 1:30 or 2 o'clock, I got in the car with the flag and went over. And by this time, there was a very large crowd.
This was in response to a call from Andrei's team.
From Andrei's team. And at that point, there was a large and growing crowd intermingled with the tanks, and everybody's sort of milling around. So the car goes through this crowd and drives up, and there is applause, and so it felt pretty good. And I went in, and I frankly do not remember who I met at that point, but I got the message that they wanted the United States government not to recognize the action by the so-called GKCP, and that they hoped that we would support constitutional order.
Jim, I got to ask you,
yeah.
You said it's 1 o'clock in Moscow. By this point, someone has clearly woken the president. Who is that?
I don't know who woke the president, but we had already been in touch with the State Department. We had an open line to the so-called Operations Center in the State Department. People were waked up.
You had not briefed the president at this point?
No. Well, you know, presidents don't normally listen to Chargés. But when I got back with this message, it was, in fact, George Bush who was on the phone. And so I, first of all, explained what had happened, that I had been called to the White House and had received this message that they wanted me to convey. And then I said to them that, frankly, in our judgment, there wasn't any reason to rush toward any acceptance of the outcome here, that things were very confused and tentative, and we didn't see this as terribly well organized. And therefore, I hoped we would, first of all, be very cautious. But secondly, that it was clearly not a constitutional move by the people who had done this. Mm-hmm. And since that was the position we'd taken at 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock in the morning, that became the government position, mm-hmm. I'm happy to say. Okay. And so that was kind of that's how we started off, I guess.
Okay. Now, Sergey, you came to all of this just a little bit later. Why was that? What did you find out, and what did you then see?
Я был довольно далеко от Москвы.
Just a moment, so everyone can put on headphones who wants a translation.
I'm sorry.
No problem.
Я был довольно далеко от Москвы, может быть, 600 километров, и в довольно глухом месте на севере от Москвы, куда мы ездили вместе с моей семьей и друзьями много лет и до этого, и после этого. Такой дом отдыха в лесу. И это был отпуск. Впрочем, это был последний день отпуска, потому что на 20 августа было намечено очень важное событие в Москве. Я собирался все равно вернуться, не зная ни про какой путч. И, может быть, мы еще вернемся к этому. Это было важное событие. В Москве должен был быть подписан новый союзный договор. И ждали, что приедут лидеры всех республик. И это будет чрезвычайно важное событие. Поэтому я знал, что 20 числа мне надо быть в Москве. Но в результате оказалось, что та ночь, которую я провел в поезде по дороге в Москву, это была ночь с 19 на 20 число, и к этому моменту я уже знал, что происходит в Москве. Точнее, я знал официальную версию того, что происходит в Москве. Это была, может быть, самая страшная ночь в моей жизни, потому что мне казалось, что я еду на войну. И пока я ехал в этом поезде, конечно, я не мог спать, и я вспоминал рефлекторно все то, что я знал о разных путчах, государственных переворотах, революциях и мятежах. И рисовал себе ужасные картины, что в Москве сейчас происходят массовые аресты, что мои коллеги все в тюрьме, наверное, их пытают, может быть, уже кого-то расстреляли. И меня, конечно, тоже ждет что-то подобное. И в результате я придумал целый сложный конспирологический план, что ни в коем случае нельзя приехать на этом поезде в Москву, потому что, конечно, на вокзале всех будут арестовывать. Поэтому я вылез из этого поезда примерно за 100 километров до Москвы и дальше добирался просто на машинах. И когда я приехал в Москву таким хитрым конспирологическим образом, оказалось, что это совершенно ни зачем не нужно. И я мог спокойно спать в этом поезде и спокойно приехать на вокзал, потому что ничего этого нет. Никаких арестов и никаких репрессий. И, в общем, на тот момент еще почти не было никаких войск. И я прямо с вокзала приехал в Белый дом. У меня не было с собой никаких документов, у меня не было моей пресс-карты. И я все-таки не решился пойти домой, потому что последняя мысль у меня была, что, ну, наверное, дома-то меня ждет КГБ. И, конечно, когда я попытаюсь открыть свою дверь, тут-то меня и арестуют, поэтому домой я на всякий случай не поехал. Конечно, это тоже было зря, можно было ехать. Ну, в общем, я пришел в Белый дом, и у меня не было никаких документов, и я очень боялся, что меня не впустят внутрь. Но охранник, который стоял в дверях, знал меня в лицо, поскольку я был политическим репортером и довольно часто бывал в этом здании, где находилось правительство России и Верховный Совет России. И он меня пропустил. И в следующий раз я вышел оттуда через 4 дня. Потому что понятно было, что ни в коем случае нельзя удалиться от этого места событий, где происходило столько всякого интересного. И где был, вот это очень важно, где был такой легкий доступ к информации. Вообще нужно понимать, что Москва в это время — это рай для журналиста. Это место легкой и быстрой информации. Не существовало никаких пресс-секретарей, никаких пресс-служб. Я не знаю, была ли у министра Козырева пресс-служба. По-моему, нет.
Вы, наверное, смотрите на пресс-службу.
Да, по-моему, не было. И действительно, в течение этих нескольких дней можно было получить прямой доступ почти куда угодно. Ну, может быть, к самому Ельцину трудно было подойти, потому что он был все-таки окружен охраной. Но за исключением него все каналы были открыты, и все было видно, и все было понятно. Так что это был центр мировой информации в этот момент. Моя газета действительно была закрыта. К тому моменту, как я оказался в Белом доме, я уже знал о том, что газета не вышла в предыдущий день и не выйдет в следующий день. И знал о том, что мои коллеги создают новую, такую временную, общую газету. Она так и называлась «Общая газета», которая выходила на протяжении 10 дней после этого момента. И, что очень важно, очень быстро организовалось огромное количество таких партизанских возможностей для распространения информации. Это тоже интересный сюжет, что Белый дом и те, кто оказались внутри, депутаты, члены правительства, пользовались поддержкой самых неожиданных людей. И уже утром 20 августа, да, очень рано утром, и я это видел, к Белому дому подъехал грузовик, и из него выгрузили несколько удивительных и очень редких в то время в Москве больших копировальных машин, которые были большой редкостью и большой ценностью. Кто это был, я не знаю. Я думаю, что это были какие-то коммерсанты, какие-то бизнесмены, которые поддерживали, которые сразу решили, какую из сторон они будут поддерживать. И вот приехала машина с этими копировальными аппаратами, и приехала другая машина, в которой было очень много бумаги. И с этого момента Белый дом превратился в импровизированную типографию, потому что там производили огромное количество листовок и маленьких плакатов, которые расклеивали потом по всему городу. И работа журналистов, которая была внутри, отчасти заключалась еще и в том, чтобы сочинять вот такую литературу, а не только обыкновенные газеты. Кроме того, колоссальную роль в то время играли международные информационные агентства. Я в то время работал параллельно с газетой в одном из них, в агентстве «France Press». И это было время, с одной стороны, большой конкуренции между France Press, AP, Reuters и другими мировыми агентствами, японскими, например, которые были очень сильными. Но на эти дни между ними было заключено перемирие. И я никогда не видел больше такой кооперации между такими ожесточенными конкурентами.
Sergey, in terms of the press, it's clear that the coup plotters understood the need to shut down the Soviet press, but they missed so much. I mean, they left individual reporters free,
Yeah.
and then of course you had this international press and this new CNN with the cameras. Well, why did that happen? I mean, why was it that the media essentially was free in the course of what was supposed to be a coup?
Ну, конечно, это была одна из самых грубых ошибок. Не хотелось бы быть советником у ГКЧП, и никто из нас не дал им этого совета, что мы, может быть, первые, чью работу нужно прекратить, но, тем не менее, это было так. И действительно, неподготовленность этого путча и колебания, которые были внутри ГКЧП, и их нерешительность, и их страх перед тем самым, что они делают. Вот это, мне кажется, очень важно понять, что люди, которые сделали мятеж в августе 1991 года, очень боялись того, что они делают. Они понимали, что они делают что-то ужасное. Они это знали с первой минуты. И людей, которые были настроены решительно, и людей, которые понимали смысл того, что происходит, было среди них, может быть, двое. Это был глава КГБ Крючков и еще один очень важный автор этого путча, который остался в тени и который не вошел формально в ГКЧП, Анатолий Лукьянов, ближайший друг Горбачева, председатель Горбачевского Верховного Совета и человек, который совершил, на мой взгляд, самое тяжелое предательство по отношению к Горбачеву в тот момент. Вот я думаю, что эти двое понимали, что они делают. Я думаю, что они отдавали себе отчет, что это очень большая история, и я думаю, что они были готовы на многое. Но все остальные, кого они привлекли к этому делу, по-моему, совершенно не были готовы устраивать настоящий переворот. И первая грубая ошибка, которую они сделали, действительно это. Они не прервали работу журналистов, хотя они остановили несколько газет. Но они сделали еще более важную ошибку. Они не проследили детально за тем, что происходит на телевидении. И в первый же день, и 19 числа, и 20 числа в информационных программах на федеральных российских телеканалах, которые контролировались государством абсолютно, в информационных программах прошло несколько сюжетов, которые очень ясно дали понять людям вокруг, что этот путч еще не победил, и что борьба продолжается. Там почти ничего не было сказано, но просто сам факт, что там достаточно полно и достаточно объективно было показано, что происходит в Белом доме, что происходит с Ельциным, что происходит вокруг Белого дома. Когда люди увидели это, они поняли, что борьба еще впереди, что она еще не кончилась.
So for the mass of people who were not immediately at the Белый дом on that day, millions and millions of Soviet citizens, would you say that it was this limited but nonetheless basically free media?
Да, не так много людей пришли туда сразу, но очень много людей начали приходить туда именно после того, как они посмотрели несколько сюжетов в информационных программах. И эти сюжеты были странно свободными, странно неподцензурными. И они, конечно, сыграли колоссальную роль, плюс листовки, которые были расклеены по всему городу, плюс общая газета, которая появилась. у людей создалось впечатление, что борьба только начинается.
All right, so one of the famous images, which then was available on CNN cameras and very quickly throughout the world, is Yeltsin standing on the tank. I understand you played some role in that decision, but maybe in gratitude for that, you didn't stick around very long. Tell me how that happened.
It happened exactly at the time when we were meeting with the international press, which we called, and Yeltsin was speaking. He actually read. That was first time he read his statement denouncing the coup, and in the middle of that, it occurred to some of us, including my humble self, that probably those guys were not kind of determined, or maybe there was not obedience among the troops, because and commanders, we were actually not, we were not waiting for tanks, because it was absurd. I mean, to deal with a handful actually of people, a tank, you don't need it. I mean, it's enough two actually, maybe one, even a KGB commander with a simple gun, a shotgun even. So, I mean, all that was mind-boggling, and it occurred to us that probably there could be a contact with the troops. And we asked Alexander Kozyrev, who was in charge of Yeltsin's security guard, bodyguards. Outstanding personality, by the way. And he was very courageous. They spoiled him. Yeltsin spoiled him. All spoiled him. I mean, later he kind of changed. But at that time, he was absolutely amazing. He was serving Yeltsin. He was protecting Yeltsin already for 2 years, almost without payment, in confrontation and in conflict with the KGB, where he served, because he was, of course, the officer, career officer of the KGB. So this guy said that he will go out and see what happens exactly, and maybe try to speak or whatever, I mean, kind of test the waters, what is going on with those troops. And he came back and said that the situation drastically changed, because there are lots of people. By that time, there was already lots. Later, it was kind of incrementally growing every hour, every 10 minutes. But even by that time, there was already impressive amount of
Russians
people.
came fashionably
Russia,
late to the
yes,
coup.
yeah, but those were civilians, mostly young people, who came there actually to demonstrate, and very quickly organized themselves actually into a kind of guards also, and they took position between the troops and the tanks and the entrance or entrances to the big building. So that was change number one. So that was already absolutely clear that now, for them to enter, they had to storm through the crowd, and probably it would be kind of confrontational, and those guys were determined to block the access. So that.
But you're obscuring the fundamental fact. You told Yeltsin to climb on the tank. Is that right?
Actually, I did, but whether I was one, and you know, he never referred to that. I never referred to that. Nobody ever referred to that. So, but I did. And after that, Kozyrev went, came back with all that information, and he also came back with the information that the troops are not aggressive, that they are doing nothing, and they kind of even friendly in a sense. And that's how Yeltsin said, oh, if that's okay, that's a good idea. So he just stood up and Burbulis and of course Korzakov and his guards, and he said, I wanted to go too because it was just interesting. But he said, no, you remain, you will go on with the press conference because the press conference was, so I had to sit there and continue conversation with the journalists because I was the only one kind of in charge of foreign whatever relations, be it diplomats or journalists. And they went outside and then they came in kind of 15, 20 minutes back. And that was exactly the amazing situation when he mounted the armor and read again the statement, but that time to everybody. And I mean, that's miraculous, actually. That CNN, I'm sure, they were standing somewhere right before me, you know, in front of me. And we were sitting at the podium, like here, at the press conference. So Jim would go for Yeltsin, and Matt will go for Burbulis, probably. So we were sitting like that, talking to the journalists, and CNN TV camera was right here. Now, later on, I learned that they were shooting in the live Yeltsin's address on the tank, right? That was the CNN which transmitted all those events and all those images. So they probably had more than one camera already in the White House when we were disorganized, government was disorganized, everything was disorganized, but CNN was there.
So
all over there, you know?
So the tank is remembered thanks to CNN, thanks to Yeltsin, thanks, I guess, to you. The tank is remembered as this moment, the symbol of triumph. But clearly, Yeltsin and you were not convinced that you were going to be victorious because you left the country that night. Why did you leave?
I left because it was not that clear. It was clear that it's disorganized. It was clear, as Sergey said, that they were probably even afraid of themselves, but that there was no proof, on the other hand, that they would not move, or somebody would not move. And we knew, of course, quite well.
You mean militarily move against?
Military, and especially we were more afraid, like Sergey, we were more afraid of KGB. We were not afraid of military. It's a long story, but I can explain why. We were afraid, of course, I mean, in the Soviet Union,
sure,
and probably in the neo-Soviet environment today, everybody is not so much afraid of the military.
Right.
Everybody is afraid of the security service, and those were serious guys. And we knew, I knew personally a little bit Khrushchev. So if Yanayev was a kind of drinker and a good guy, I knew him also personally by that time. He liked to tell jokes and everything. Of course, he was very conservative, but not a fighter, not a real tough guy. But Khrushchev was no joke, and we knew that. So we were expecting the KGB to start moving, especially when, and I think they really did. I mean, they tried to flex some muscle. They didn't shoot, they didn't kind of arrest us, but it was kind of very, very confused situation, and by the middle of the day, they cut almost all the telephones from the White House. There was considerable pressure by that time. It was kind of two conflicting trends. One trend is that some press started to act, and actually Echo Moskvy was very, very active. The radio was not shut down. But on the other hand, the crowds were growing and growing, and that by that time, for the military to move, it would be total disaster. I mean, really bloodshed of enormous proportions. So we were not afraid of the military, but KGB could, of course, penetrate even through that crowd and everything. So it was very, very tense, and it was scary. Kind of, some moments were more scary than the others.
But you made a decision to leave the country that night, and it was for a reason.
Yes, because Yeltsin wanted, it was his idea, he wanted two things. He wanted to set up a government in exile, and one government in exile he planned in Sverdlovsk, and he appointed one of his closest friends, actually from the Communist Party apparatus.
This is his home region.
Believe it or not, yeah. But he sent him there, so he departed. We departed almost at the same time, because that was the decision, to take one group inside the country in case they crack down, because it was still in the cards very much, and one sent somebody abroad to be able to proclaim government in exile abroad. And then there was quite a discussion, and when he first presented this idea, he of course called a small group of his advisors, and he said, how about that? And we all said, yes, of course. I mean, that's a great idea. Secondly, I said it should be Lukin. Why Lukin? Because Lukin was Vladimir Lukin. He was chairman of the International Relations Committee in the Verkhovny Soviet, in that quasi-parliament, yes, Soviet kind of parliament, but he was freely elected. He was different. There was a group elected by old rules, and there was a smaller group probably elected by new rules, really elected by people. So he was progressive, he was democratically minded, and and my argument was that he had better chance to go through the tanks and through the encirclement because he was deputy, and deputy of the parliament, be it Russian or Soviet Union's parliament, they, by law, were untouchable, so to say. The law prohibited to abduct them, to stop them even, for police. So that would be additional kind of power for him to make it through, and at least to go to the airport and to take a plane. And almost the decision was taken, though Lukin was a little bit reluctant, I should say, to do that. He didn't want to, but, I mean, yes, he was evident choice. Then Shahrai again came with the legal argument. And his legal argument was, I still don't know whether it's true or not, but his legal, probably yes, his legal argument was that if Lukin goes, they would not recognize him as a representative of the government. They will recognize him as a public figure, kind of, but not official. So, so he will not be able to proclaim government in exile, because he has no government position, he has parliament position. And he said that in that case we need to give him special credentials, and again, that was too complicated, so he said it's impossible right now to arrange these kind of credentials which would be acceptable for the international community. So he argued that the only person except for the president himself, or actually vice president, third on command was foreign minister who can do it ex officio. And that's how I was sent.
That's the Kozyrev Parisian vacation. Okay, we're running short on time. I want to make sure that we get to what this event meant in its immediate aftermath, because of course we all know how it ended. But what did it mean then in the months afterwards? I'm especially interested, you had a new ambassador coming in, you had an American president, Jim, who's obviously facing what is ultimately an unsuccessful re-election. Was anyone aware at that moment when the coup fails that this is, by the way, also the end of the Soviet Union?
Well, I think it's a two-part answer. First, I think any of us who had dealt with the Soviet Union as we really thought the Soviet Union existed knew that the coup ended it. And it did so because the Communist Party was removed from power. The Soviet Union you cannot imagine as Soviet Union without the communists in charge. And so, I mean, from my point of view, the Soviet Union as we knew and loved it was gone. And that the coup did that. And I mean, I remember watching in some awe as half a dozen people with a couple of rifles went and closed down the Central Committee of the Soviet Union on the so-called Old Square Staria Ploshchad. It was insane. And I said in many cases that the Soviet Union was canceled for lack of interest because there was just nobody there to resist this kind of action after the coup failed. But it's also true that it did not end efforts to recreate or create a new structure based on some kind of inter-republic agreement that would have preserved the Soviet Union as something new. But the coup essentially ended the Soviet Union as an ideologically structured and driven political entity.
But what about this dynamic that we're also aware of now, Gorbachev versus Yeltsin, Soviet versus Russian? Was there a realization in the corridors of power of Washington that in losing the Soviet Union, you might also lose your partner, Mikhail Gorbachev, with whom you'd achieved all of this?
Yeah, I mean, look, there was certainly a great deal of, and I hate the word, but of concern about what was happening to the investment we had in the things like the START agreement to reduce nuclear weapons, the other kinds of new arrangements that were emerging between the Soviet government, the United States, and the Allies. There was no question. But it was also true that everybody understood that the Baltic states were already insisting on independence. Georgia had proclaimed its independence. And others were not quite sure what they were. So I would say for some time, for a couple of months, we did watch very carefully what was happening with this negotiation to try to create something like a Soviet Union in a very new form. It was also pretty clear that it wasn't working very well, and that the growing sentiments were for the republics or the national entities and groupings to demand more all the time. And this was, I think, enhanced because when Gorbachev came back, it was pretty clear that Boris Yeltsin had saved his bacon. And that Russian Federation was not simply going to sign up to something that Mikhail Gorbachev almost alone decided was important. And so, I think we probably spent more time thinking this union treaty had a chance than was realistic. And I remember Jim Baker came, I think it was in November, and he asked me as I drove in with him from the airport, did I think this was going to work? And I said, rationally, if everybody worked according to what was in everyone's self-economic interests, you would keep things together. I said, but the emotions are all the other direction, and therefore the chances were not very good.
Okay, so Sergey, on the theme of emotion, take us a few years forward. Take us through the end of the Yeltsin era and into the Russia that we've begun to know today. Clearly, there's a huge breath of fresh air and hope, but also there's crisis and difficulty and so forth. Does the memory of the collapse in this experience of the coup, the people, as you said, the free media, all of these nascent institutions of democracy, does that continue to have meaning once you get into the mid-1990s and you have economic restructuring and inflation and chaos and war in Chechnya? Or basically, did Russians forget about it?
Я думаю, что все уверены в том, что путч 91 года и неудача путча 91 года разрушила Советский Союз. С этим все согласны. Но совсем не все согласны с тем, кто внутри этого путча 91 года хотел разрушить Советский Союз, а кто хотел сохранить его. Тут большие разногласия. И мне как раз кажется, я уверен в этом, что люди, которые противостояли ГКЧП во главе с Ельциным, парадоксальным образом пытались сохранить Советский Союз. Хотя посол Джим Коллинс абсолютно прав, нет никаких гарантий, что идея союзного договора дала бы какие-то, во всяком случае, долгосрочные результаты, но надежда на это была. Гарантий не было, а была надежда. И люди, которые устроили этот путч, они как раз больше всего боялись этого союзного договора, нового, реформированного Советского Союза. А Ельцин, который, несомненно, был ярким противником и ожесточенным противником Горбачева, пытался быть его противником внутри Советского Союза. Не было первоначальной идеи оторвать Россию от Советского Союза и оставить Горбачева с одними узбеками, таджиками, армянами, белорусами, но без России. Этой мысли не было. Путч сломал эту логику, и несмотря на то, что в сущности Горбачев и Ельцин на короткое время объединились после этого путча в попытках сохранить Советский Союз, это было, по всей видимости, уже невозможно, и хватило этих усилий всего на 5 месяцев после...
Sergey,
Да-да.
in Putin's time, we hear very frequently the phrase about this great geopolitical tragedy, this regret, right? Did ordinary Russians feel, in any sense, regret knowing what they had allowed to happen in their society?
Это огромная дискуссия, которая происходит в России и сегодня, и которая, конечно, происходила в августе, когда в России был, все писали о 25-летии этого путча. Где ошибка? И кто совершил ошибку после августа 1991 года, в результате которой все, что было выиграно и все, что стало результатом победы тех, кто противостоял ГКЧП, куда-то делось, куда-то пропало, а вместо этого получилось то, что получилось. Ответ, конечно, заключается в том, что никто не совершал ошибки. И вообще никакой ошибки не было. Россия построила себя после 1991 года такой, какой она хотела себя построить. Не произошло никакого перелома, не произошло никакой контрреволюции после 1991 года. Просто революция была не об этом. Революция была другого рода. Я совершенно согласен с теми, кто говорит о том, что 1991 год это не демократическая революция, не буржуазная революция, а прежде всего потребительская революция. Прежде всего то, что хотели тогда люди в России, они хотели лучшей жизни, лучшего быта и лучшего потребления. И они получили это. Они, несомненно, в течение многих лет после этого очень понемножку улучшали свои условия жизни. Вопрос в том, что они обменяли на это улучшение условий жизни, на другие потребительские стандарты, на другие потребительские возможности. Конечно, там было много экономических подробностей во всей этой истории. И главная экономическая подробность заключается в том, что эпоха правления Ельцина — это $10 за баррель нефти, а эпоха правления Путина — это $100 за баррель нефти. Если вы хотите знать какую-то одну вещь, объясняющую историю развития России в конце 20-го, начале 21 века, то это одна вещь, вот это. Это разница между 10 и 100. Между бедной страной в эпоху Ельцина и богатой страной в эпоху Путина, потому что такова была конъюнктура. И это определило очень много.
Jim, when you look at the position that the United States adopted during the coup and then in the critical months afterwards, this transition from the Soviet Union to the new Russia, and when you look at the role, the anticipation of the Western role that you heard from Russian officials and from the Russian people, is there a lesson for dealing with Russia today for American policy?
Well, I think if I had to say one probably judgment that we may well have made in error, it was the depth of meaning that the actual putsch and failed putsch had for the vast majority of Russians in the way they thought about their government, their future, and their society. What became clear was, they got rid of the Communist Party as the driving force, as an institution. They turned over government to those institutions that existed, and then they built a new constitution, more or less on a model of a combination of France and America and others. But what they didn't really have in this revolution was a true social revolution. I mean, I think what was remarkable was the degree to which continuity outmaneuvered change. And so, I used to say, you would go out to a province in Russia, and here you would meet in 1991 in the summer, the first secretary of the Communist Party of such and such oblast, right? You went out a year later and you met the new Democratic governor of such and such oblast, but it's the same guy. And the problem with all of this really was that you didn't have a capacity, or you did not have a change that really turned over to a new generation or a new group of people. Things like the local governing structures, the people who were running factories. All of these people were the same people who'd been doing it on August 18th. And that really was a drag on the capacity for change. And I think that a lot of us in the Western governments sort of focused too much on a pretty narrow, small group of people in the capital who really did change things, but who had a terrible time making change happen more broadly across the country and getting people to accept what was happening. I mean, my example of all of this used to be that, we would have people come to give economic advice, not realizing that most Russian citizens had never had any experience with what real money meant in a market economy. And so it was a huge transformation, but we overestimated the degree to which change had happened because it happened in the capital, and how long it was going to have to take to change the social thinking and economic and political thinking of a population.
So Andrei, before we open the floor to the audience, aside from a lasting paranoia about Tchaikovsky ballet, what what does the memory of what happened and what it meant for you at that time, what does that continue to mean throughout the many years of your career in Russia and also now as you look at Russia today?
That's typical discussion which illustrates that on that day and those 3-4 days, yes, we were all on one side. We were all united. After that, a discussion what next started, what next in practical terms. And at this table, we are still on the same side, I mean, basically. But for instance, the head of the parliament at that time was Bulatov, and Yeltsin's this time Yeltsin's vice president, not Gorbachev's vice president, but Yeltsin's vice president. In 2 years, they tried a mutiny, actually. They organized a mutiny to overthrow, at that time, Yeltsin, and some of us we were in the list for immediate kind of disposal of. So, I mean, despite that we were all together there, the moment we were looking in the window, those two guys were standing by me, and I was standing among those. So, and they participated in everything. Because, yes, you know, it's, you can turn a live fish into a soup, right, with the fish soup. But how to make the opposite process? That's the main. That was, and it's still the question Russia is wrestling with. If you deprive people from private property, from any knowledge of market, or even any knowledge of freedom, as a matter of fact, and they don't know what to do with all that and how to do that and what it means. Mm-hmm. So to go on that, I differ with Sergey with all due respect. I think it was not the commercial or material interest revolution. It was spiritual, it was mental revolution. They wanted freedom, we wanted freedom. We wanted democracy. Of course, we had a very, very kind of vague idea what it is, but it doesn't matter. I mean, when people converted from one faith, like from paganism to Christianity, they also had very, very vague notion of what Christianity is. But they probably had an idea that it's much better, something much better, right? First of all, spiritually at that time. So I believe that it was a revolt of the best in Russian people, especially, of course, in Moscow, especially in intelligentsia, especially in the most educated people, those who were carriers, actually, personal carriers of a culture, of Russian culture, and the Russian soul, so to say. That's why it will come back. That's why it was the highest point in Russian history so far, the highest point in thousands of years of Russian history. Revolt of Russian soul, of Russian spirit, for freedom, for better world, for dignity, if you want dignity, first of all. Mm-hmm. And that still sits there, but of course it kind of now in perverted sense, that's what actually Putin's regime tried to capitalize. They say your dignity is diminished, or your dignity is under pressure from who? From Obama. Not anymore from Jim Collins, but personally from Obama, from the United States. Mm-hmm. And they try to speculate. So they again basically come to the same point, that it's dignity, but at this time dignity denied by foreigners, not domestically. But at that point of time, it was absolutely clear that there was popularly elected Yeltsin, popularly elected, almost free elected, with a competition of 5 other guys, all appointed by the Communist Party and supported by mass press and everything. But people voted. Don't forget that it was millions of people who voted for Yeltsin to be elected. And had Gorbachev listened to us, we were trying to advise, my humble self, we were trying to advise by all means, humbly, him to go to elections in the Soviet Union. That was the only way, and that was probably a good chance to keep the Soviet Union, not of course the communist Soviet Union, Jim absolutely right, but a new kind of federation or confederation. Had at the top of the government of that new agglomeration or whatever, a confederation or federation, had there been a personality, a leader who had same legitimacy in the view of Russian and Soviet people, as a matter of fact. And what happened after the putsch? After the putsch, everybody understood that there is Gorbachev, who calls himself president of the Soviet Union, but appointed by whom? Appointed by those guys who supported the coup, appointed by the Communist Party, basically, appointed by the KGB behind the scenes, appointed by the Съезд and Верховный Soviet, which was Soviet-type deputies who actually did not revolt. None of them revolted against the coup. Who revolted against the coup? Against the coup revolted Yeltsin, popularly elected president, and part of the Verkhovny Soviet and some government which was sticking to that notion that he is popularly elected president of not of the Soviet Union, but at least of Russia.
Well, we know.
So that was so clear to people, and that's why the Soviet Union collapsed immediately, and it was a revolution of conscience, or revolution of dignity. And despite what again, one more argument, just very, very simple, very short. The economic hardships came next day after the new government was installed. Next day, not years after that, not by the time of Putin coming. It was next year. The inflation was like galloping. It's very, very polite and mild term for that, right? It was skyrocketing inflation. So people were in desperate position immediately, next few months, because what was done, it was so-called the prices, stopped control of the prices because there was no other way, and the prices skyrocketed. The prices for piece of bread were more than salary for people. So they suffered, but there was a next test. When in 1993, in April 1993, that is 1 year and a half after all that hardships, all that catastrophe, economic catastrophe for people in Russia happened, the referendum was taken. And the question on the referendum was, there were a number of questions, but basic question was, do you still trust, do you still support President Yeltsin? And you know what? They voted yes. Absolute majority, despite it was freedom of press, right? There was right press, there was left press, there was opposition to us, opposition press. Freedom of agitation and everything, but they did vote. So if they were looking for their pockets, they would have kind of vote Yeltsin out at that referendum. But they did confirm that it was their, they were looking for dignity. Why and how then it was lost, that's different story.
Okay, so that's a very appropriate note since we have elections coming in Russia this month. It's an appropriate note to conclude the panel on. Correct. You get what you wish for. Be careful what you wish for. We have limited time for questions. We can do maybe 10, 15 minutes. So what I would suggest is let's take a round of questions and comments. Keep your hands up high. We have microphones on both sides of the room. And please identify yourself. I know that we have some people in this room who have some pretty unique experiences. But if we can keep it compact, that would be great. So, hands? Yes, sir, right here.
And one request, just if you're leaving early, please don't forget to return the transponders for your headsets.
My name is Stephen Shore. My question is, could we say now that the putsch of 1991 was the February Revolution of our time, or is that too early?
Okay.
That it was what?
Was it the February Revolution of our time? Yes, Wayne. What was the October Revolution then?
Wayne Murray, the American Foreign Policy Council, and I was also in Moscow with Jim at that time. I want to clarify one historical point about that first day. When Jim got back and he had that phone call with the president, I was present because we only had one working telephone line between the embassy and Washington, and that morning some damn fool hung up the phone. And it took us over an hour to get the connection back, so we covered the cradle with masking tape like a mummy to keep it open. But when Jim had that phone call, it was with a big audience. Everybody in the political section was there, and nobody thought to give the boss a moment's privacy in his phone conversation with the president. So I remember that one end of that phone call rather clearly. I also remember what it led to. President Bush, who was at Kennebunkport, gave an impromptu press conference in which he was asked by one of the reporters about, recognizing, dealing with the new government. And he said, I thought the three most important words of his presidency: coups can fail. And that message went vividly back to people in Moscow, that the American president was not going to associate with this new team. And that those three words, coups can fail, were one of the most important things in American diplomacy in my lifetime. And it was the result of a phone call between a president and his chargé.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, right here.
Victoria Feinberg. I emigrated from the Soviet Union in 1979, and I was in England during the coup. My question is about the role of the other embassies. The American embassy seems to have taken the lead, but what about the British, Canadian, French, and other embassies?
Very good. And we have one back there and then one back there. Natalia, if you can just be ready. Yeah. Go ahead.
My name's Thomas Grindley. I understand that President Putin is said to have declared that the dissolution of the USSR was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. I find that difficult to believe. Do many Russians share that point of view? Bear in mind that Lenin was a vocal proponent of the USSR's formation, but it seems to have been voluntary on the part of the constituent republics. To what extent was the dissolution also voluntary?
Okay.
Had it not been just a marriage of convenience?
Right. Okay. And last, right there.
Thank you. Tad Daly's my name. Mr. Kozyrev, you made a great case at the very end there that Yeltsin had the legitimacy of being popularly elected a year or two earlier, that Gorbachev did not have. But I, to this day, 25 years later, I still don't understand how that led to the dissolution of the USSR. I would not suggest that you, Yeltsin, and the people around you were solely motivated by self-interest and ambition. But just from that perspective, wouldn't Yeltsin have aspired to be the president of the Soviet Union rather than of a rump Russia? Wouldn't you have rather been the foreign minister of the USSR rather than of this rump state that emerged?
Okay, two very, very quick last ones. Yeah, Igor right here. Just a second, Igor. Natalia, быстренько.
Igor Zivlев, Wilson Fellow. Very brief comment and very quick question. Brief comment, I side with Andrei on the estimate of the spirit of those events. I was on the streets of Moscow for 3 days, and those days were probably the only days where most Muscovites felt that they were on the right side of history. And that was absolutely a unique feeling. And a brief question, why do you think the coup was so poorly organized? You, Andrei, referred several times to KGB and to fear of the security services, but why did they fail? It still amazes me. Thanks.
Yeah, great. And then very last right here, quickly.
Yes, my name is Julia Lavilla, and I have just a very quick question. What do you think was the purpose of the coup? If it was to preserve the Soviet Union actually dissolved quicker. It seemed to have contributed to its dissolution. So it served the opposite purpose. So that's my first quick question. And the second question I have is, how would you assess, how would you evaluate the outcome of that failure of the coup 25 years ago? Since we celebrate the 25th anniversary now, do you think it really failed or it hasn't really failed? Did people who opposed the coup really win, or they lost?
Okay. Well, I think we had a couple of questions which were specifically directed at Andrei. Andrei, if you can just literally a couple of minutes. I think the question about Yeltsin's ambition, if your recommendation had been taken, would Yeltsin have sought to preserve the Soviet Union, and would he have wanted to be president?
Of course. Yes, that's very, very, very accurate description. Of course we wanted the Soviet Union, and of course Yeltsin wanted, even in his rivalry with Gorbachev, personal rivalry, and whatever were Yeltsin's many aims, actually, probably there was two personalities. You can speak of Yeltsin as head of democratic movement, but you can also speak of Yeltsin as just Communist Party apparatchik fighting for the top position, for power. Both are accurate, actually, to my mind. At that time, it coincided, and that's why, that's the key question. There was no opportunity to have all-union elections because Gorbachev feared to go to elections. He didn't want to go to elections. Even when he had all the possibilities for that, it was enough for him to speak publicly, to tell, not to look at the KGB or anything at earlier stages. There was about a year when we tried our best to persuade him to just coin the word popular elections in the Soviet Union. And I am sure, I can bet, that nobody would stop him. No coup will happen at that point if he said that. There would have been popular election. How is it important? It's fundamental fact, fundamental situation. He was legitimate in the eyes of the Russian people and in the eyes of the Soviet people around and in republics as a Russian leader, as leader of Russian people, because he was legitimate. He was popularly elected, first time ever in centuries. While Gorbachev, he blocked the election, so he had no legitimacy at that time. That's why the Soviet Union basically collapsed, because we in so-called, in Russian government inside the Soviet Union, we were looking for Yeltsin as a legitimate source of authority. I joined the so-called Foreign Ministry of Russian Federation, a ridiculous kind of thing. I mean, almost by definition, not because I wanted to be a Russian diplomat inside the Soviet Union. From my very good position in the Soviet ministry, but because I thought that this is the only source of legitimate power in Moscow. So that's the situation, and that's the answer to all those questions. Yes, that's why the Soviet Union collapsed. In Moscow, there were two leaders, one legitimate in the eyes of Russian people who voted for him, and one who lost all the legitimacy even before that, but at the coup, as I said, the coup was supported by the Communist Party. The coup was supported by the Верховный Совет, the Верховный Совет of the USSR, the quasi-parliament of the USSR. That was the body which appointed Gorbachev president of the Soviet Union, not people of Russian Federation, but this body. But that body, during the coup, that was the key issue. It lost any kind of respect because they did not revolt against, they did not stand against the coup. They were behind the coup. Right. They were supportive of the coup. So the coup was identified with Gorbachev's power base, with Gorbachev's legitimacy, see? Yeah. And our legitimacy, or Yeltsin's legitimacy. But of course Yeltsin wanted to be president of the Soviet Union. But there was no election for that. I think
this also answers the question about the February Revolution rather clearly. Jim, what can you tell us about what you saw other foreign embassies, and of course in particular other Western embassies, doing at that time? What was the role that they were playing?
At the very beginning, I don't actually know. But certainly within the sort of early days, the Western embassies were talking to one another. There was a basic move on the part of the people who were opposing the putsch to engage the diplomatic corps to go and say essentially, well, if Yeltsin's not well, let us go see him. Or, you know, let's have a doctor go down on our part. I mean Gorbachev. Right, yeah, sorry.
Calling the bluff.
Yeah, and in a sense, at the very end of the coup, that's what happened. There was, I mean, it didn't happen actually, but what happened was an agreement that a delegation of diplomats would go to see Gorbachev and see, is he well? Is he ill? What's going on? And this was already the end, because it was a sort of a surrendering. Now there was a sort of, you know, Alphonse and Gaston operation that took place, and nobody ever actually went. But in the process, Gorbachev was then returning to Moscow, and it was over. But the Western embassies were all basically in the same place by the second day, let's say, when it was rather clear what was happening and who was doing what.
Sergey, last word on this. Igor's question, I think, haunts many of us to this day, which is, when we look at Russia today, where the authorities are so seemingly effective at crushing dissent and eliminating any possibility for a mistake, I mean, this is like a comedy, how many holes were left in this coup. How is it possible? And these were the real pros.
Мне кажется удивительным образом, что этот вопрос нужно объединить с другим, совсем не похожим на него, который здесь тоже прозвучал, насколько добровольным был распад Советского Союза и насколько люди этого хотели, действительно ли это тогда выглядело геополитической катастрофой и так далее. Это один общий вопрос. Никто в 1991 году не хотел умереть за Советский Союз. Советский Союз был не нужен огромному количеству людей, живущих в Советском Союзе. И люди, которые попытались спасти его таким отвратительным, циничным образом, очень быстро почувствовали себя в одиночестве. Почувствовали себя без какой бы то ни было поддержки. Ни в армии, ни даже в КГБ. Андрей совершенно прав, что в этом смысле КГБ был гораздо более жесткой организацией, от которой можно было ждать гораздо больше неприятностей, но даже там было очевидно, что никто не хочет спасать тот Советский Союз, который пытается заново провозгласить ГКЧП. Законсервированный Советский Союз, архаичный Советский Союз. Советский Союз, не остановившийся в августе 1991 года, а Советский Союз, откатившийся на догорбачевское время. Поразительным образом они в 1991 году попытались восстановить Брежневский Советский Союз. Никто не хотел умереть за него, никто не хотел рисковать за него, никто не хотел бороться за него. И, между прочим, никто не готов был проявлять жестокость за него. Вот это вещь, о которой мы не говорили сегодня, а между тем это очень важная вещь. Нужно вспомнить, что во время этого путча, который, да, действительно, в конечном итоге предопределил скорый конец Советского Союза, погибло 3 человека. Только 3. Совсем немного, но целых 3. Эти 3 смерти произвели на всех огромное впечатление. И люди, даже те самые, которые были в этом ГКЧП, страшно испугались этих 3 смертей. Это было время для Советского Союза, для начинающейся России, в котором эти 3 жизни значили очень много. И очень большая разница в отношениях между этим отношением к человеческой жизни и сегодняшним отношением к человеческой жизни. Когда для политической цели сегодняшняя Россия вообще не жалеет и не считает человеческих жизней. Мы не знаем, сколько людей погибает каждый день, сколько людей погибнет сегодня в Восточной Украине. Мы этого даже не знаем. Этого и очень мало кто в России сегодня хочет это знать. В этом на самом деле трагедия. Тогда эти 3 смерти имели колоссальное значение. И эти 3 жизни отпугнули очень многих. Потому что тот Советский Союз, который жил в головах этих членов ГКЧП, был никому уже не нужен. И от этой картины, которую они попытались нарисовать, возвращение к Советскому Союзу брежневских времен, в ужасе бросились в разные стороны все советские республики. Почему в результате путч так ускорил распад? Да потому что уже невозможно было удержать ни Украину, ни Белоруссию, ни Казахстан. Я перечисляю сейчас те республики, в которых было меньше всего сепаратистских настроений в тот момент. Я не говорю уже ни о Прибалтике, ни о Грузии, ни о Молдавии. Я говорю о тех, кто должен был бы сохранить костяк Советского Союза. Они в ужасе бросились бежать из того Советского Союза, который они вдруг увидели на 3 дня, слушая людей из ГКЧП. И люди из ГКЧП довольно быстро поняли, что они в абсолютной изоляции, у них нет ничего, и их никто не поддержит, никто не отдаст за них жизнь, никто не отдаст за них карьеру, никто не совершит для них подвига. Я думаю, что это то главное, в чем они просчитались.
Sergey, that's an exceptionally important point on which to conclude today when we're a day after the 15th anniversary of September 11th, by the way, that maybe the one analytical and human factor in all of this that we can learn with certainty is that the relationship of a society and of its government to the question of human life is determinative. That it will tell you a lot about that society and where that society is headed. And I think it's something we ought to bear in mind in our own country as well as when we look at Russia today. Will you please join me in thanking this incredible panel? And thank you, all of you. Спасибо. Большое спасибо.